I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as I am each week, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. And Elizabeth, you have dug out a case that is from the past. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this. Maybe some people haven't. But it's also a case that has a connection to today as well. And that is the case of Genene Jones, who is also known by another term. Correct, Elizabeth?
Yes, the angel of death, or the killer nurse. This case is 37 years old, Chance. I'm going to date myself right now. I was in college studying journalism when this case was going on. Genene Jones was in her 30s. She worked in the pediatric intensive care unit of University Hospital, which formerly was a medical center hospital here in San Antonio. This was from 1981 to 1982. And as we said earlier, she was nicknamed the killer nurse. Her shift even was referred to as the death shift after her crimes made national headlines. She was convicted of murder in the death of a 15-month-old toddler from Kerrville, Texas. She was given an overdose of a muscle relaxer and died. At that time, Genene Jones was, like I said earlier, she was a pediatric nurse. And she was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But a law that went into effect while she was serving her time would have made it so that she would have been released this month, which, would have just, really angered this entire community. I mean, this case went national back then because it's not even known how many children she might have killed, but there were about, I believe, it was a 1985 New England Journal of Medicine study that found that during the time she worked at Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio, 42 babies died, 34 while she was on duty, and the infant death rate increased something like 178% during her tenure there. This is from the archives of the San Antonio Express News. So she was convicted, like I said, of one crime and was sentenced to 99 years. But had she not been indicted late last year, she likely would have been released. And just to tell you a little bit about this and for our listeners, late last year, there were 5 new murder indictments from the mid-1980s that involved deaths that occurred in San Antonio hospitals. Genene Jones was arraigned, and she's now being held in the Bexar County Jail. Bexar County District Attorney Nicholas LaHood, whose office brought the new indictments in these tragic incidents, he had vowed that he would try her on each and every indictment that they could get on her to make sure that she, I believe the quote he used was, took her last breath behind bars. He was defeated in the recent Democratic primary for district attorney, but already one of those indictments is slated at this time to go to trial by the summertime. So I just wanted to share a little bit about these, since this case is, like I said, it's 37 years old. Chelsea McClellan lived in Kerrville with her mother, and she had gone to see a doctor there who at that time employed Genene Jones as a nurse. And the child became ill under her care and, died. And like I said earlier, her indictment her conviction rather, sent her away for that particular crime. But DA LaHood here has said that Jones could be tied to upwards of possibly 60 deaths in and around Bexar County of these children. The true number of deaths connected to Genene Jones has never been proved. So these new indictments, 5 so far, were returned late last year. And in those allegations, the most recent one in October of last year alleges that Genene Jones caused the death of 3-month-old Paul Villarreal by injecting him with a drug called heparin on September 24th, 1981. The other indictments involving the victims here in the Bexar County area were for Richard Ricky Nelson, who was 8 months old when he died July 3rd, 1981. Patrick Zavala, 4 months old when he died January 17th, 1982. And Rosemary Vega, 2 years old when she died September 16th, 1981. And the first one, actually, indictment that came out last year was in the death of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who died December 12th, 1981. So these children who died 30, up to about 37 years ago, it'll be a very sobering thing to see their families have to go through a trial, so many years later after these crimes were to have taken place. When Genene Jones was brought back to San Antonio in December, this last December, it was a Thursday morning, and she entered in a wheelchair, and she wore a face mask to hear these new murder indictments against her. She's 67 years old now, and in talking with her attorney, Cornelius Cox, he wouldn't really say just exactly what particular ailment she has, but the thought at the time, being that it was December, was I guess the flu was starting to make the rounds, but she never took the mask off when she entered into the courtroom, and she was arraigned. Normally an arraignment is, which is the formal reading of criminal charges, is usually done by a magistrate. But this time, probably a combination of the notoriety of the case and also the media attention, it was conducted in the 399th State District Court, which is presided by Judge Frank Castro. And it was full of media, it was full of spectators, and there were some people, if you just looked at someone and said, oh, well, this is Genene Jones, there were some gasps from some people in the gallery who recognized that name right off. And others who, if you use the terminology that became popular at the time when she was in headlines almost every day, killer nurse, angel of death, the death shift, people kind of, became aware or were reminded of the headlines of those days when the trial was held in Williamson County. So one of the things that happened right before her arraignment was Nico LaHood, the district attorney, had held a press conference, and he announced these new indictments. And we had discussed at the time, in a question and answer at a press conference, that had these deaths occurred today, Genene Jones would have been charged in each case with a capital offense, because the law has now changed after her conviction that if someone kills a child under 10 years old, you're facing capital murder charges, which is an offense that is punishable by death or life in prison without parole. So LaHood was very matter of fact in his comment about that. He's very passionate about crimes against children. He had said without hesitation that had these tragedies occurred today, that she would have been charged with capital murder. And he said, although she is open, his office would be open, and she probably as well would be open to a plea bargain that would hold her accountable. He said that his goal was that she remain behind bars. So even though you really probably only need one case against Genene Jones to keep her, if she was to get a conviction, to keep her, behind bars for the rest of her life, I think the thought here is that if they have the evidence, which they apparently do, even though it's an old case, with 5 new indictments, they want to take those one by one. So during her arraignment, her attorney, Cornelius Cox, replied for his client on each of the indictments, which were read by the judge. When he asked for her plea, Cornelius Cox replied on each charge, not guilty. So another thought is that she wants to not make a plea, and she wants to fight it out in court because she has pleaded not guilty. So those are a couple of things that have been tossed around just in conversations with attorneys and courthouse watchers about this case. That day, Genene Jones didn't spend a whole lot of time in court. The arraignment actually went pretty quickly, and she was taken from the court, and relatives of the child victims had sat back in the front row. They also were whisked away through a back entrance. But there is certainly interest in this case still, 37 years later. And, people have talked about, what is the big hurdle that could be faced in this case. Her attorney says that you have to go back 33 to 34 years to try to see what really happened, to try to find people who might have worked with her, who might have seen something, what kind of, there's been a lot of advances in how evidence is collected and how things are tested these days. But her attorney definitely points out that the big hurdle is going to really be able to dig as deep as they can and look into where she worked and who she worked with to try to see what they can come up with, and that they can add to with what they already have with the indictments that they've brought today. So this should be interesting to see. She's, again, being held currently in the Bexar County Jail on with a bond of $1 million on each of the 5 charges, and she is going to remain there until her trial opens, which, as of the court's online records as of today, is telling us could happen in July. So that should be interesting to see if we can get a case moving by the summertime.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Elizabeth, this, like a lot of cases that we've discussed here on The Docket, is just a horrid crime, a horrid situation. But for many different reasons, this is something that I think a lot of people, not only in the local area, but anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, if they heard about this case, they might just be fascinated by it. And it reminds me of a lot of the cases that I saw growing up watching the History Channel. Oftentimes, those cases were like several decades, way in the past, where this one is a little bit more recent, around the early to mid 1980s. And it's interesting because, we started off talking about how this case has now a current connection with Nico LaHood, vowing to try these cases, and then this upcoming one that you've talked about. But also, you mentioned how the current DA, who, as you've also talked about, lost the nomination, so he will not be the next DA, talked about how this case would have been handled if it had happened today. And that's very interesting to me, because that's something that I've been thinking about this entire time, Elizabeth. Just for a moment, could you imagine what it would be like if this happened today? The way that social media works, the way, the media itself, just, outside of the internet, how everything has changed. And not only that, the lawsuits that would then continue after this. So you'd have, criminal court proceedings, and then the lawsuits, the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that just in my mind, I think would pop up as well. So that was something that I can't stop thinking about. I just wanted to know what you thought about this, how different this case would be, not only perhaps in how it would be tried by the state, but how everyone would be talking about it across the country, if not indeed the world. This would be a fascinating case now versus a fascinating case in the past, but now we have the internet.
Well, yes, exactly. Which, even back then in the 1980s, they actually had to have a change of venue because of the media coverage. So you can only imagine what social media could do. I mean, I have thought to myself while I was thinking about talking about this today, was that, gosh, we have had Genene Jones back in the news since last summer. And my thought is, at what point are they going to go to what they had to make that decision to go to a different county, 37 years ago? The child lived in Kerrville. This happened in Kerr County, which is in, the San Antonio area in the Hill Country. And, Genene Jones worked in Bexar County, and there was also another case that was tied to Bexar County. That was a serious bodily injury case of a child who survived, a 4-month-old child who was overdosed with blood thinners. This child survived, and, they ended up having the trial in Williamson County. So, gosh, social media today would be just amazing on this case, because it is something that even back then reached, was the news around the world. I mean, you think of a woman being convicted of killing a child, a nurse, someone who worked in a pediatric intensive care unit, somebody who's, basically has the hands that help save lives, in a situation. I mean, I think that people today still have so much interest in the case itself. I think that and you think about the families also. I mentioned earlier that, these are cases that go back to 1981. I was graduating from high school then. There you have it, dated myself. And then, the convictions happening in the 80s, while several people, were just, nowadays they are looking back and thinking, what about these parents? Those children would be close to 40 years old if they were alive today. And in a sense, it's tragic any way you think about it. But then you also think about how a person has to relive the entire, loss and grief, again from, 30 something years ago, except now, the big question there is what kind of justice is going to be served with that, being such an old case. So across the board, it's just, again, yet another very tragic, story of crime out of the area, but one that so many people have so many memories of and ties to, just because it was just such a horrific event that occurred.
I feel like there's so much more we could talk about concerning this case, Elizabeth. But finally, I'm wondering, what were thoughts at the time? And this might have also been very different if these crimes had happened now. But at the time, what were the thoughts of the reason why Genene Jones committed these crimes, or at least the ones that she was convicted for? Was it mental illness? That's something that comes up a lot now with crimes that affect a lot of people, usually mass shootings. Was that the case? What were people thinking? What was the motivation for killing children?
Well, there's a syndrome, I believe it's called Munchausen syndrome, that where, you kind of want to, it's kind of like the hero syndrome thing. I've heard that in speaking with Patty McClellan Weezy, who is Chelsea McClellan's mother. She is the woman who, that's the only conviction that they were able to get on Genene Jones, was that of her daughter's death. And in speaking to her after the last trial, and in law enforcers who were attached to this particular case, she was very smart. She wanted to appear to be, the hero. Oh my gosh, this child is in distress. I'm going to save the day, so to speak. And there were several news articles that were written by my newspaper and by other competitors. And in doing all of the research, as I said, I was in college when this happened. It's not like it was a recent case, but when I was doing the research, there were a lot of stories written about how, she was kind of the smartest person in the room type of person. It's possible that, she found herself in a situation of where she was in control and wanted to bring more attention to herself as being in control. At least that's what people I've been speaking with have said about that. But, gosh, how do you wrap your mind around something like this, where, you're a parent and you've taken your ill child to someone to care for them. And then, something like this happens. And then to think of all of the children who happen to die under her care, it just kind of really, brings a chill you know, to even think that is even possible in a human being.
Yeah, and just imagine, if your child had died around that time, and after this case comes out back in the mid 80s, there are so many possibilities that we've just discussed of what she might have been involved with. But imagine if you were a family member, a mother, father, a sibling, and then, your brother or sister, son or daughter had died around that time. That must have been a question that you've been thinking about this entire time, and probably will until the day you die. So yeah, such a horrific case, but once again, as we've discussed for so many reasons, such a fascinating case, and it's now coming back after it's been gone for so long.
Yes.
So this is something that Elizabeth will probably be discussing again in the future, but we're going to call it a day for today's episode now. I've been speaking once again with my weekly co-host, San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, for today's episode of The Docket. Thank you for a very in-depth discussion today, Elizabeth, and I will speak to you next week.
Thank you very much, Chance. Appreciate it.
And big thanks to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.